Well, good afternoon, everybody. For session 3, welcome to this wonderful series with Father Tom, and happy International Day of Peace. Today is the day for us to try to live what we declare, right? What we hope for, what we want so much. So please join me in welcoming Father Tom. Yay!
Can you see me okay? The lighting all right?
Whoops.
Okay, I'm in a new configuration here, so. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you. This is the prayer for the time of the Synod, which will continue to October of 2023. And then hopefully by that time, the synodal process will be integrated into the full life of the Church. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to be our shepherd, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are always in need of grace and transformation. Help us to promote love, respect, and understanding. Let truth be our guide, justice our purpose, and love our goal, as we welcome all into the friendship of our communities. Let us find in you our unity, our sense of communion, as we journey together to the fullness of life. Help us to walk in the light of your wisdom, as we seek to do good in our world. All this we pray of you, who are at work in every place and every time, in communion with our beloved God, who every day reveals a mother's love and a father's care, forever and ever. Amen. Well, today is the International Day of Peace. And in our 4-part series on peace, we first of all looked at peace in ourselves, then peace in our community. Today, I thought it would be wise to focus on the philosophy and the meaning of the International Day for Peace. And then next week, conclude the series with some insights into international peace. If last week we used the Gospel of Luke and the parable of the Samaritan to speak of community peace, next week we'll use the Gospel or appeal to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, which Jesus goes international when he crosses the lake. Perhaps we can discern in the crossing of the lake to the other side some true elements of peace that would make sense in our lives today. In order to situate a philosophy of the International Day of Peace, it would be good for us to review some of the material that we already considered. I look at peace as flowing in 2 directions. First of all, what I think is most important, even though it's counterintuitive, is that the peace that we seek is already within us. In our first session, I invited you to consider the depth of your heart and the depth of yourself in the same way as an oasis in the depth of your mind, heart, and soul. So instead of always trying to strategize peace in the world, it is first of all to claim that inner peace in the depth of your heart. In almost any situation of life, no matter what the chaos might be around us, we oftentimes meet people who hold the center. They're not anesthetized, nor are they indifferent. But in holding the center, they appeal to the depth of their heart, and rather than react to the moment, they respond to the occasion. Now, the famous adage says that if you want peace, work for justice, is quite true. But I think it's also true that if you want justice, then claim the peace that's in your heart. Think of the circumstances of life where around you something might happen that invites you to violence. It invites you to curse. It invites you to swear. It invites you to prejudice. It invites you to fear. It invites you to strike out. And oftentimes when we do something, we might regret it and wish we would have thought about it before we did it. And of course, the trick, if you will, or the practice of interior peace is to have consciousness, mindfulness, and alertness all the time. If you seek to have consciousness and alertness sometimes, it's a lot of work. But if you make the conscientious decision and practice mindfulness or alertness and consciousness in everything you do, it becomes easier. It's like breathing. If you deliberately think about breathing, it might become hard to do. But even if you were to fall asleep, you don't stop breathing. Your mind, your subconscious, your consciousness, never stop absorbing the material around you and never stop processing the dream within you. Second of all, it's important for us to remember that as you look out into the world, there are thousands upon thousands of organizations through the world, especially in places of conflict, that work for peace, that work for justice. These are people who do not see peace and justice as pie in the sky, but something that you work for and something that you practice. And sometimes I think when we get overwhelmed by the way the world is, when we see corruption in the highest forms of government, when we see duplicity and injustice in the church, when we see people fail miserably in their relationship to other peoples, we can lose hope. And it's on those occasions that it would be good for us if we had a list of those organizations that are at work in the world all the time to make the world a better place that come up out of the quest for justice and the practicing of peace within their heart. These may be organizations that you know, organizations that you participate in, and organizations that you support even financially. If we look at what oppressed people do, if we were to look, for example, at what's going on in Ukraine, here we see an unjust aggressor, namely Mr. Putin with his armies, that really have overwhelming military might, but they have no sense of purpose except to destroy. And people that come from very deep spiritual backgrounds say that when the depth of your heart seeks to do nothing but to destroy another person, you will end up destroying yourself. And of course, Mr. Putin would destroy two things: the language and the culture of the people. He declared several months ago, there's no such thing as Ukraine. Therefore, there's no such thing as Ukrainian people. So one of the ways a people claim their inner peace, not only as individuals, but claim their inner peace as a community, is in their claim to culture. We see this, for example, in the slave trade in the United States. Back in the time of slavery, some of the most beautiful and important music was born from the mind, heart, and souls of the slave. Today, that music may have passed into the sanctuary of our more established churches. Churches that desires to sing the songs of the slave must be very, very careful not to involve themselves in structures that oppress people, not simply to be inspired by the music, but by the example of people who could sing even in the midst of oppression. Besides culture, there's also the splendor of nature. So many times in the midst of the storm, you and I can be consoled by the rainbow, the flight of a bird, the beauty of a flower, the magnificence of a creature that walks across the backyard. So nature itself, as a matter of fact, the beauty of nature. Pope Paul VI and Pope Francis have both written magnificently that oftentimes poor and oppressed people find a sense of interiority and interior peace when they can quest for what is beautiful. The beauty around us opens up the beauty within us. So I just wanted to go over a few things, not necessarily in any kind of logical order, but to till the soil of how this peace is not some idealism in the future that we quest for, but something that we even find in the rubble of life as it is. Now, the International Day of Peace, or the International Day for Peace, was established in 1981 by the United Nations. Now, as you know, there are people, even in the Christian community, who are fashionable to bash the United Nations, because they'll ask the question, well, what good does it do? It doesn't have any power. But it's one of the few international organizations where the nations have an opportunity to debate and to meet each other. And when you look at the work of the United Nations and what has been consented to over the years, the documentation is quite important. And I know it's fashionable for some people to make fun of documentation. But remember, the New Testament is a document. The Old Testament is a document. Your grandmother's letter to you when you were a little child is a document. A photograph is a document. The photograph of your grandchildren going to kindergarten for the first time is a document. Documents are meant to be pondered and surveyed so that their wisdoms can so touch our lives that we make a difference within the world. What motivated the International Day of Peace for the United Nations is that every year before they began their deliberations, they would dedicate a day to peace. So no matter what the conflict might be within the world, the member nations, to some degree, would commit themselves to the process of peacemaking and the observance of peace. Now, on a personal note, I would like to say something about this. The Interfaith Peace Project, of which I am the co-founder, began in Pittsburgh, PA on September the 8th, 2001. And when it did, we became friends with a particular person from the United Nations who was in charge of the International Day globally. And so for a period of time, the international offices of the International Day of Peace was in the same place as the Interfaith Peace Project, and we worked together side by side. This man was a former Army general who became one of the founders, if you will, of the International Day of Peace. And this is important for us to understand because sometimes people think that if you're pro-peace and practice nonviolence, that somehow or another you hate the military and you despise the police. That's ideological fascism. Intelligent people who live in the real world understand that people, even in the military and the police, are not necessarily to be identified with fascist ideologues waving guns at people. Don't do that to people. Don't stereotype people that way. Don't make pacifist and nonviolent people into la-la land, and don't turn police and military people into mass killers. As a matter of fact, if you like to kill, you are not fit for the military or the police. So it is interesting that people who fostered the International Day of Peace through the world were oftentimes people who served in Vietnam and were acutely aware of how wars can be unjust. Sometimes unscrupulous politicians always want to use their armies to hurt people. And it's the generals who put restraints on them, that everything cannot be answered with a gun. I think that element here is very, very important because it's oftentimes in people who know the power of weaponry, who understand how this weaponry must be of last resort, if at all. The resolution for the International Day of Peace I included in the notes. You'll see a summary on page 1, the resolution on page 2. So in 1982, the first International Day of Peace was held. Now, what are you supposed to do on the International Day of Peace? Well, let's look for a moment at international days in general. As you know, there are many international days that come from the United Nations. There are 2 in particular that we at the Interfaith Peace Project celebrate religiously: the International Day of Peace and the International Day of Women, which is March the 8th. So important is September 21st, the International Day of Peace, and March the 8th, the International Day of Women, that on the 8th and the 21st of every month, we publish an essay for reflection on peace and on the wisdom of women in the world. We also observe International Harmony Week, which is the first 7 days in February. So there are important days of the year that raise our consciousness. And I would encourage you and your local churches to observe these days, to look at all of the international days and say, which ones would fit our sanctuary space? Which one would enliven our participation within the world? Because the particular sanctuary of a particular church ought to be a place where the world meets, where our consciousness goes global, where our consciousness goes to the neighborhood, where our consciousness goes to interfaith, ecumenical, and global practice. So one of the reasons for the international days in general is that issues have a human face. Behind every issue, there are real human beings. When we talk about peace and women, we are not talking about abstractions. We're talking about very, very real people that we meet in the real world. So the International Day is meant to be a day of consciousness. Now, what oftentimes happens is that if we overprogram the International Day, once the day is over, the issue goes out of our head to the next year. Or planning the International Day for Peace, for example, can become stressful. What are the 5 things that we have to do? If you look at the philosophy of the International Day for Peace, this is the core of the philosophy: to practice peace from our hearts in everything we do ordinarily. It is not primarily a day to invent programming, to have seminars or concerts. That's all fine. But the essence of the International Day is that people such as ourselves in the so-called ordinary affairs of life for 24 hours can practice peace in everything we do, from sleeping to bathing to eating to answering the door to driving in traffic. And if we can practice peace, that mindfulness of presence to the other, with friendship, care, respect, and love for 24 hours, then just maybe we can practice peace one day at a time for the rest of our lives. If this reminds you of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous or Al-Anon or any recovery group, you're right. That's exactly what it is. So it's not simply programming. It's not simply seminars. Even though tonight I will go to a program. I will lead a walk in Brentwood, California. I'll give a little talk on peace. We celebrate the International Day of Peace all year long. Every day of the week is International Day of Peace. Peace can't be a hobby or a sidebar, but it's in all the affairs of life. I will make my salad with deep love. I will be mindful that if I share this salad with a friend, we can have peace at the table. That if I take care of my health, then I can be present to another person. It is very, very important for us to realize that peace comes from within. In any circumstance of life. Okay, let me stop there and say, any questions, any concerns, anything you would like to share?
Are we aware, or are you aware of anything, any recognition of this? Because, I mean, in terms of, is this something we're going to see on the news tonight, that things were done, or that, you know, this, and is it still the first day that the UN meets, the beginning of their session? I don't even know.
I'm not quite so sure, but I tried to look that up. I think it's in the spirit of that. I think that the organization may have moved on to other ways of doing it.
Mm.
You know, how they start their session. I have to do some research on that one. I actually tried to, but couldn't find it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just, I mean, lovely to hear what's being done around the world, or some awareness.
Well, just look at the way the liturgy begins in our churches. May the grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you.
Mm-hmm.
That word peace has a very holistic understanding in the Jewish Christian tradition, and certainly within the New Testament itself. Grace and peace is a slogan from the Roman Empire that was taken over by the Christian community.
Didn't know that.
So those languages, that language we have within the liturgy, even before we break the bread and share the cup, let us share with one another the peace of Christ. So think of how many times that word peace shows up. And in many cultures of the world, that's the way they say hello and goodbye, is the greeting of peace. Shabbat, shalom, salam, may peace be with you. Now, a very lovely way to put it is, my peace is with you. And I pray that your peace will be with me. Okay, let's now deepen this a little bit, and let's go to page 3. Since the United States, and I hope that soon we will follow the example of Canada, in order to make restitution to Native people and Indigenous people for the destruction of their land, their culture, and their way of life. But still, we have high-powered politicians in the United States who would continue to do damage to our Indigenous heritage. And we're still waiting for the formality of the church to not only rescind the doctrine of discovery, which dehumanized Native people, but also to reveal what other documentations the modern popes at the time of Columbus issued. This will be a time for us to reconsider the names of our organizations. Should we continue to name our organizations after people who committed genocide, who disgraced humanity, and really injured the gospel terribly? We have to take accountability. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, invited us to pay attention to indigenous language, indigenous people, primarily because of the alignment of much of indigenous spirituality with nature. For those of you who may know of the Tao Te Ching, which has become very much a part of people's lives, the Tao, what it is, the Tao and Taoism takes its impetus from nature. The energy of nature moves over into the Taoist practitioner. You see it sometimes if you're sipping your morning coffee and you look out the window and your favorite bird lands on the fence. After a couple of days, you might say, "Oh, hi," to the little creature. There's a sense of communion that goes beyond you. On page 3, there's a Su prayer that I would like to share with you as we enter into the ethos, if you will, in the environment of peace. Oh, great spirit, let me walk in beauty. Make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things that you have made. My ears sharp to hear your voice. Let me learn the lessons you have hidden in every leaf and rock. I think it's these kinds of prayers from our indigenous heritage that invites us to the practice of peace. In the front of the Interfaith Center, there's a family of lizards. And I'm trying to meet them. And they sun themselves on the rocks every day. And every day I walk out very, very gently. They look up and I look down and they all run away. And I said, well, I'd run away too if I saw me coming. But then the other day I walked outside and very, very quietly, and there was a couple of lizards sunning themselves on the rock. And I went, hi. And they stayed. They stayed for a period of time. And you know how those little creatures can be. They either run like lightning or they're like stuffed. So they were paused, so I paused. And we just looked at each other and enjoyed the moment. To the lessons you have hidden in a lizard. And of course, the lizard was on a rock. And I thought, in light of this prayer, what is the rock teaching the lizard? What is the lizard sharing with the rock? So we talk about mindfulness and peacefulness. Notice what these kind of prayers invite us to. One of my famous quotations from a physicist, and much of modern mystical language is not coming from religion, it's coming from the physicists. What's happening right now is we're caught up in the James Webb telescope that's seeing where we live and have never seen before, the depth of the heavens and the stars. On September 2009, Roger Penrose, in an interview with Discover magazine, was asked the question, when physicists finally understand the core of quantum physics, what do you think that theory will look like? And Penrose responded, I think it will be beautiful. And of course, for those of you in the Franciscan tradition who have deep love for St. Francis, and especially for one of Francis's greatest followers, St. Bonaventure, Bonaventure is the one who said that theology must be beautiful. I often thought that biblical interpretation must be beautiful. How we read a biblical verse must be beautiful. One day I was talking to a woman down the street who had a beautiful garden. I don't know how she does it. She always has flowers that are blooming and happy no matter what the weather is. It's 118 degrees, she has beautiful flowers. It's a flood, she has beautiful flowers. She always has beautiful flowers. I don't know if I admire her, if I'm jealous of her. I once asked her, do you want a job? Come up the street and plant some flowers. She said, it's very different up there than it is down here. It's a block away. But she's so sensitive to the earth, so sensitive to one block. We're talking about microclimates. They change every 2 feet. She has beautiful flowers. How do you grow such beautiful flowers? She said, that's the trick. Stop thinking you grow beautiful flowers. Beautiful flowers grow something in you. She's at peace with the earth. All of you know people, you know people who are at peace with flour, and they can bake. They can bake up a storm. But when you eat their bread, there's a secret ingredient that makes it tasty. My grandmother used to say her secret ingredient was her love for her children. These sound like nonsense statements. They sound like poetic statements in La La Land. But they really come from the interiority of a person. One of the most important people in the field of interfaith love and respect and understanding is Bede Griffiths in the Benedictine tradition. He represents a powerful crossover between Hinduism and Catholicism in particular. In pondering the mystery of religion, he said it's found in the heart of every person. It is written in their heart. It is a law that is written in their heart. And of course, the old word religion is synonymous with the word peace. That's why we say, peace be with you. As a matter of fact, we say, may the peace of our God be with you. May the interiority of God reside within you. May I take you to page 4? Now, this is getting a little personal, but I would like to share with you today, because I take today very personal. I've been dedicated to the practice of this day for 25 years, and not simply once a year, but every day. I do with this day what I don't do with Christmas, and that's saying a lot. But I'm looking at the word interfaith, interreligious, interspiritual on a day like today, the International Day for Peace. In 2015, I started using a different word than interfaith and interspiritual and interreligious. I started to use the word interpath. As a matter of fact, if I was starting all over again, instead of the Interfaith Peace Project, it would be the Interpath Peace Project. Because what I've discovered over the years is that people make sense out of their life, not only with their religions, but with that which is meaningful within their life. Let me use a few examples. Once I met a man who loved to climb mountains. I met him in confession. He came to confession and said, bless me, Father, if I have sinned. I missed Mass for 3 months. I said, oh, okay. Is there a particular reason? You find the liturgy boring, your parish is hostile? Oh, no. He said, I love the Mass. I love the liturgy. I look forward to it. I try to live it. Oh, well, were you sick for the past 3 months? No, he said, I was climbing mountains. Oh, I said, like 24 hours a day? He said, yeah, like 24 hours a day for 3 months. He said, I go away on these long trips and I live in the mountains. I figured out not only how to climb them, but how to live in them. They're my teachers. See, did he miss Mass? Or did he enter into the what I call the ethos of the Eucharist? Now, you can look at mountain climbing as a sport. You can look at mountain climbing as an activity. You could look at mountain climbing as sightseeing. But for this man, it was a way of life. It was his spirituality, so to speak. Perhaps this man did with a mountain what I oftentimes don't do with my religious practice. I may enter into my religious practice in a perfunctory way, but he climbed the mountain in a sacred way. Once I was visiting a family. This is example number 2. And it was a little 4.5-year-old boy. And how little kids can be. They can be as shy to the point where they become invisible, or as bubbly to the point that they never go away. This little kid was a bubbling little fountain of delight. If a perfect stranger came to the door, that was his new best friend. What a way to live. Everybody that comes to the door is his new best friend. Imagine if everybody who came to the door of our church was our new best friend. So I'm sitting on the sofa talking to Daddy, and the little kid comes over and hands me a cookie. And I took it. I said, I love cookies. The father said to me, he is a cookie. He eats so many cookies, he is a cookie. He loves cookies. And then the father said something that was very touching. He loves to give them away more than he loves to eat them. The pathway of the little boy with a cookie. Is it religious? Is it formal? Boy, when it teaches something tremendous, the pathways. So I discovered people on pathways of life. They may not be explicitly religious at all, but they're pathways that intersect and touch our lives deeply. Imagine a father saying about his son, he loves to give them away more than he likes to eat them. He found something that was delightful. And he just made the assumption, if I like it, you'll really like it. I'll give it to you. I remember when I was 5, if I found something I liked, I hid it from everybody else. It's mine. Go away. So the pathways in our lives are not always religious, not always under the category of spiritual. They may be the strangest categories in the world. Once I lived on the street with an elderly gentleman. The street had millions of kids. I don't know what it was about that place, but there were kids all over the place. And every once in a while, there was an elderly person, but there was this one elderly man. And the little girls used to like to play, what is that game, hopscotch, where they jump from one thing to the other. And every day the old man would come out and all the little girls would line up and the old man would try to jump from one square to the other. He could never do it. He had to sort of like tippy-toe from one to the other. And when he got to the end, he threw his hands up and all the little kids rejoiced. It was the greatest scene in the world. Upon reflection, it reminds me of what it is to be church. Some of us get it. Some of us have won. Some of us are at the end. Others are crawling. rather than put people down, but to rejoice in the elderly gentleman who did everything in his power to jump from a circle to a square. And when he couldn't do it, he tippy-toed, and all the little kids rejoiced. Interpath, the pathways. Maybe there's pathways in your life that you thought were insignificant, meaningless. And yet when you see the results of that, the practice of that is what peace looks like. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that peace is not a strange word or an esoteric definition. It's a reality that's in your life more than you think. And when we move it into mindfulness and perception, we begin to see how much a part of our life that it can be our guide in the here and now of life. Our pathways intersect. Airports, bus stations, buses, streetcars, subways, BART are wonderful places to intersect. I'm going one way, you're going the other way, and we met. Even if for a nanosecond, we met. And that meaning is where peace is born. Okay, any thoughts, any reflections? Anything you'd like to share? Any pathways?
Father, I wanted to check and see, the International Peace Day, is there any country that has really rejected that, or another country that has really grasped onto that? Or is it pretty much just, it's International Peace Day? Do you know of any that are like that?
If you go to the site, if you go to the United Nations website for the International Day of Peace, you'll be able to see what countries, organizations are responding in the moment. The website will show you organizations. So the interest and focus has not been on what particular nations are doing, but what particular groups of people are doing inside a particular nation. And some of them are a little bit surprising. Now, one of the things, thank you for the question, one of the things I didn't bring up that's important is that over the years, the International Day of Peace has had a focus on the day. So this year is racism. Now, I'm not altogether sure I'm happy with that. I'm not really happy that they put a theme into the International Day of Peace, because I think it's important for us to see peace not as an abstraction. But what has happened over the years is to say this year, the focus of the International Day of Peace is racism. And so if you look at that, you'll see many organizations in the United States in particular, where we're confronting the infrastructure of racism like we never did before. And you see those organizations that are rising to the fore to deal with the issues of the day. The other thing, Howard, that it's really important with these international days is that they don't get competitive. So sometimes, especially in first world nations, well, we did this and you did that, and we had more people than you did. And then we slide back into what irritates us, makes us upset, and gives us a sense of shame and failure, as opposed to what gives us the drive to continue to discover the peace within, so we may radiate that peace into the world. Now, interestingly enough, I would think that if there was a country in the world today that manifested peace, and this is going to sound strange, it would be Ukraine. Not because of the lack of weaponry. I always regret that we have to use weapons. But the driving force in the Ukrainian people is their culture and their sense of being a people. And also, if you know something about Ukraine, Ukraine actually believes that it's fighting Putin in the defense of democracy in the world. So Ukraine is not simply fighting for its own survival, but for democracy in the world, which invites me to think, am I willing to dedicate myself to democracy in the United States as much as the Ukrainians are for the sake of the world? So I think that question, which is a very important one, I would put it in the area of discernment. That as you look at the website and you do the exploration, and even see if it comes up in the news, and if it doesn't, then to say, well, maybe I should call the TV station. Did it come up in the church? Was it announced last Sunday? Was today devoted mass for peace and justice? These prayers exist in the Roman Rite. It's not like they don't exist. And here's where individuals such as ourselves, especially in the synodal church, can make a difference. So on Sunday, I gave a talk at the homily in the Presbyterian Church that has a United Church of Christ congregation with it as well. And we pondered the International Day of Peace in preparation. So here again were liturgical committees, the social justice committee, the outreach committee, the musicians. When the International Day of Peace, it always falls on the 21st, so it doesn't always fall on a Sunday. But that doesn't mean on the Sunday you can't raise the consciousness. Anybody else? Any thoughts or feelings? Just go to International Day of Peace. Yes, my dear.
Hello.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, I was. What are your in terms of what people can do to go back to this consciousness, awareness, mindfulness? Because it seems like there is no commitment. There's a lot of indifference in the world, and from even when you go to church, I mean, nobody says hello sometimes, or nobody, it's hard to make friends, and even in our churches sometimes. And so, what can we do, or what are your suggestions of how can people get back to this consciousness and awareness and mindfulness about our community, making communities, and so what are your suggestions? I mean, it seems like you're talking worldwide, but I mean, just as a human beings, locally to each other. I mean, what is your suggestion?
Thank you for that. It's a very practical question. I appreciate that. I think if we're speaking in terms of the Catholic tradition, one of the things to keep in mind is we don't have a strong history of coming to the church in order to practice community in a free and open way. Our understanding of community is very, very close to conformity to liturgical action. So the priest says this, we say that, we do it back and forth, and it can become very, very formal. And oftentimes when you try to do something over and above and beyond the formality of the rite, that doesn't seem to be essential. Even when it comes to the rite itself, you have people that say, well, what do I really have to attend? In 1950, when I was a little boy, sister said, if you get there by the offertory and stay to communion, it's valid. Well, it was like, well, what's the least I have to do to get the grace? So we are recovering from that. So the sense of community and fellowship and all that kind of stuff and friendship was always deemed to be secondary, or it was presumed. Now, to be fair, if you go back to the ethnic churches, the liturgy was the centerpiece of a neighborhood. So the fellowship in the neighborhood is where it was. It wasn't always inside when you went to church. It was in the neighborhood. But many of our modern churches are not in neighborhoods. They're in the middle of asphalt or concrete. They're compound, they're campuses apart from the neighborhood. That's why we're beginning to see in many parts of the United States now, as there was a period of time, it remains to be seen what it returns. But before COVID, thousands and thousands of younger people were moving back in the cities and creating something called neighborhoods. And it would have made much more sense if some of those old churches that were closed in the neighborhoods would have survived, because that's what you're going to see. So I think it's important for us to realize that when you have a church building that's aloof from where people gather, then it's going to be important to turn that community, that church, into a gathering space, as to how people can come together. There are two areas that immediately strike me, maybe three. How is the church property configured so that it is a safe haven for children? Now, in a church that now has a horrible reputation of being unsafe for kids, the future of the church, I believe, especially if it's going to persist in a suburban form, is how do these church compounds, these church campuses become safe haven for kids? And not just simply for religious formation, but for human formation and friendship. Two, do we have facilities on our church campuses for which teenagers in particular, and teenage girls can come, that may be threatened with abuse and sexual violence? Three, has our church properties been reconfigured and have dramatic outreach for people who are older? Now, notice sometimes if you have facilities that are fine for kids, they're oftentimes fine for senior citizens or older adults. I think, for example, of healthcare, rehabilitation care. Many times we have campuses by which these offices and outreaches could be together in a holistic sense of care. So it's a matter of how do we become of service to the greater population with people who know what they're doing. We also have to confront clericalism, hierarchicalism, and authoritarianism. That the church compound is not the kingdom of any one particular person, but rather has many parts within it to serve the greater community across the board. So those are some very, very practical things by which the property itself, the buildings and how we construct these buildings can be used to the greater benefit of the neighborhood, the greater benefit of the community, and that's how people meet. That's how they begin to care one for another. Now, it's very, very different than a gated community, because oftentimes the gated community, as one person put to me, it's like a cemetery in reverse. Everybody here is waiting to die. And so we see the design of that because it's important for people to mix. There is a nursing home in Connecticut that I know that had elderly nuns, elderly sisters. And what they did is they converted the first floor to a nursery so that all of the elderly women became grandmothers and great-grandmothers. So little kids were ministering to older women, and older women were ministering to little kids. It's a matter of bringing people together dynamically. Now do you want to cross over into the interfaith and ecumenical dimension, and then to the interpath dimension, and say all are welcome here. So here's where you see the progressive theology unfolding in the synod and the practice of peace in a particular church compound can come together very, very dramatically. But this is wild investment. This is reconfiguring the way you think church, as opposed to a place where we go for Sunday services or for funerals and weddings and baptism. But it's the gathering place, it's the town square, if you will, where people meet. If you go in and try to renovate people, saying you should be more friendly, that's abstract to people. What does that mean? What does that look like? What opportunities do we offer to people in the real world? And you can see churches that do this. You can see communities that do this. Darcy, do you have any thoughts about this? Because you've been hanging around parish ministry for a long time. I'm sure you have some gut feelings about what I just said.
I think you hit the nail on the head that you can't, anything that's done intergenerationally or spontaneously, to me, that's where you really see, are we a community? To me, I see community much more at coffee and donuts sometimes than I see people sitting next to one another in the pew, where they're very formal and maybe might not even say hello, or feel they're interrupting someone's prayer. But in just the gathering afterwards, it's like, or we have ladies here stuffing envelopes, and there's community there. They haven't mentioned one thing about theology, but there's that inner path that you were talking about. Like it's not dependent on religion or the religious practices even. It's the coming together of their lives. And that to me is more important maybe than what we do liturgically.
I remember once, thank you for that, I had a funeral for a 18-year-old who was killed in an automobile accident. A drunk driver killed him. And he was a very energetic young man, and he loved sports. So his parents said to me, what are we going to do for the funeral? And I said, well, he has some really close friends, doesn't he? And I said, yes, he has a lot of very close friends. I said, well, let's bring them together. Let's bring the friends together. So it's all these 17, 18, and 19-year-olds stunned, because when death comes into their lives, and it's not the death of an elderly person or a stranger across the street, but one of their own, that's a shattering moment. And so we spoke for a little bit about how they were feeling. And then after a period of time, I said, we need to put the funeral together. And I can think of no greater group of people to put the funeral together than you, because you were his best friends. And I said, well, we don't know anything about the Bible. We don't know anything about it. I said, well, that's a good thing. What do you think the sanctuary should look like? What do you think maybe the readings should be? What about the music? And if you walked in on the day of the funeral, there were baseball bats, hockey sticks, a basketball hoop, and all of the paraphernalia for the different sports this young man participated in. So that the altar was nestled in all this array of sports. And the music and the readings were accordingly, and they shared. The liturgy was the work of the people, which is what the word liturgy means. We have to get rid of the mindset the liturgy is determined by authority and imposed on the congregation. It's literally invented by the congregation. Then you own it. And one young man who had never been in the Catholic Church before, after the service, came up to me and said, is it like this all the time? Can you imagine what many of our services would look like if they were created out of the various communities that gather in the church? What if the kids in the 3rd grade took over the second Sunday of Advent? What if the people from St. Vincent de Paul took over one of the liturgies in Lent? What if the various groupings of people within the, so that every time you went, you didn't know what, oh, I hear that the St. Vincent de Paul group has the liturgy next week. Maybe there's a group of women who make quilts. Maybe the quilting society is going to put a liturgy together. You see what I mean? What would happen if the liturgy came up out of the community? Then we own it. Then we recognize it. Then we see ourselves within it. Remember, peace has an awful lot to do with the alignment of your mind, heart, and soul. And then we meet each other. And that's where the magic happens. Leslie, you're on mute. Take thyself off mute.
Take thyself off mute. Thou art off, I am off mute. I've been listening, but I was eating, so I thought it was more polite to, I was hungry. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. About 20 years ago, a friend died and she wanted Joy to the World as her recessional hymn. And Father Peters said, you know, basically he said Joy loved, and she died at Christmas time, and her name was Joy. And he said, we're kind of breaking the rules, but we'll have Joy to the World as her recessional hymn. And I kind of thought, well, yeah. So my very dear childhood friend died in July, and her recessional hymn was Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And I thought, well, hallelujah, we've come a long ways. You know, I just think that personalize some of it, like you were saying. And
Yes.
The church that I went to for a little bit here was St. Rose in Old Roseville. And that's a church right in the center of the neighborhood. You're parking in their driveways practically. And yesterday I was out at a church out on Auburn Folsom playing bridge. And as I was driving out there, I thought, who thought this up? To get in the church, you're practically the driveway, you're practically taking your life in your hands because it's on the curve of Auburn Folsom. And when you're going out, you're going the other way on the curve. And then I was thinking a little bit about as I've been sitting here, thinking about St. Paul. At least if you come in the back door, you're going through some houses and some neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but in the olden days, you were so right. My childhood church was, you know, in the neighborhood, could walk across the street and get it at the deli and get a gumball every Sunday. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but you organize in principle within the community. So you didn't think simply in terms of the liturgy, you thought in terms of the community, because you know, it was a natural sense. See, when I hear people say, how do you make a community? Well, the real question is, how do you recognize the community?
Right. Right.
A church like Peter and Paul is big enough to be a cathedral. If it was the Middle Ages, Peter and Paul would be a cathedral. And inside Peter and Paul, you can probably identify 10 parishes. Those 10 parishes are probably the 10 primary communities. Now, how do those communities meet? Well, first of all, those communities have to be able to breathe, be able to dance, and be able to sing. This is the beauty of the church right now. If we can transcend all this, we don't like immigrants, we don't like this, we don't like that, we don't like the other thing. The Catholic Church, more than any other institution in the United States, is an immigrant church.
Oh, yeah.
And there's where you see the richness of global Catholicism can be had inside a particular parish. You go to some of the parishes in Oakland, you got 5, 6, 7 different cultures of the world in the same building.
Yeah.
And there you have a wonderful way to meet those different communities if they're enhanced. So the languages, the food, the ethos, the culture all need to surface. Helen?
Oh, Father, are we so caught up in the Catholic Church of ritual that something like this, will take quite a while to catch on and to try some of these things?
Well, some of this has already been done. I mean, that's what the ethnic church was to a great extent. If you went back to the old days, and people who went back to the old days because everywhere you went was the same. That's not true. You go back in the old days, and while the mass may have been in Latin, facing the wall, the music and the culture of the congregation that met, you could tell a sharp difference between whether that community was a Polish community, an Italian community, or an Irish community by the way it lived its life. If you looked at funerals, weddings, baptisms, if you listen to the music on any given Sunday, you saw the diversity of people, and that's what we need. We need to see how they relate to each other. The ritual stability was never meant to neutralize the cultural diversity. And how you get those two to work for you. For example, what would be a stabilizing element? Well, we gather in the name of the Trinity. We gather in the name of grace and peace. We're a welcoming community of all people. That's what the word Catholic means. Catholic means we discern the presence of God in everyone, everywhere, all the time. That's Catholicity. It isn't simply that we go out to everywhere, but we perceive the presence of God in everyone, everywhere, all the time, even our enemies. You shall love your enemy and do good to those who hate you. Another stable point, a vibrant proclamation of the gospel. So that Jesus is not simply explained, but felt. When a little boy comes up and gives you a cookie, that's what you receive as the gift, give as the gift. Community participation, not simply reading rote prayers off a page, but spontaneity. The gathering rite being elaborate. So when did the liturgy begin? Well, it begins when you get out of bed. So when I was in parish work, I was out in the parking lot talking to people. What's going on? And sometimes what I heard in the parking lot changed the homily. And you credit that to people. Betty, you and I were talking in the parking lot just a little while ago, and you said something that's amazing. Can I put you on the spot? Can you share that thought with us? Or do you mind if I share that thought with somebody else, with the congregation? So when the presider becomes a spokesperson, if you will, for the community, gleaning from the community as wisdom. I'm not sure you can do this in buildings that are set up like movie theaters. Because sometimes we need to turn to one another and meet one another. So I think into the future church that's already emerging, certainly seen in the Synod, how important, and that was one of the things in the Synod report. People had a deep sense of blessing is what it is to speak to someone you always saw but never met. To actually have a structure that invited us to share with one another our faith and not simply the faith, that shared with one another our experiences. That was considered to be a great blessing. Darcy, I think I went right through the break. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. You can just keep going. I think we're okay. Stand up and stretch if you need to, folks. But I think we're good.
Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Jane,
Janet.
Janet, I'm sorry, I can't see straight.
Those of us who were cradle Catholics grew up knowing that we had to go to church on Sunday. And so we got there, we got out of our cars, we went to church, got back in our cars, and we left. It wasn't until I grew up that I found out that there were people who went to church because they wanted to,
Ooh,
because it was an experience that they wanted to have, not because they were told they would go to hell if they didn't.
yeah.
And I think that, we're coming around on that, but I think that still persists somewhat in the Catholic Church.
Isn't that an amazing experience when there's people who want to do what you think you have to do? It gives you, it gives you pause to think, well, shit, what am I doing? Maybe I want to do this too. But that's the importance of meeting one another. A great Lutheran pastor by the name of Bonhoeffer said, we ought not to assume the presence of one another. To be in the presence of another human being is to be in the presence of someone God loves. Can you imagine? I was in the store the other day, and there was a woman, she was looking at a package of something, I forget what it is. And I said to her, because I can't keep my business to myself, I said, I bought that last week and those are delicious. She looked at me and she said, well, that settles it then. I'm buying these. To be in the presence of another human being is a very sacred place to be. You're in the presence of someone God made. Can you imagine? Imagine if someone said, where did you come from? And you said, God. Now, I know I first think to say I'm from Los Angeles, but I'm from God. Oh, I am too. Now, notice how two people get excited if they're both from the same city. You're from Philadelphia? I'm from Philadelphia. Where in Philadelphia are you from? I'm from the south side of Philadelphia. Oh my, I lived on the south side. Now these two people don't know one another's names yet, or like long lost relatives that have been reunited from a desert island. Imagine, where are you from? I'm from God. I'm from God. You know God? Well, God knows me. Oh my. Let's get together and share what God is like. Let's get together and share who God is. See, we're more likely to walk in the room and try to explain God to kids rather than have kids explain God to us. In the academic world, when it's performer, you go in to explain things. In the real world, you go in to discover how things are. That's why we need each other. When someone comes into the church voluntarily, they give birth to the community anew. Now, all of us need to sit down and reconsider who we are. Now, notice the fundamental attitude that's needed there is peace, serenity, openness, welcome, alignment. Let me conclude with 5 statements from the interpath world, formerly known as the interfaith world or the interspiritual world. These are on pages 6 and 7. This is from literature, from sacred writings, and from sacred scriptures. James Baldwin writes on page 6, from my point of view, no label, no slogan, no party, no skin color, indeed, no religion is more important than the human being. Everything that exists in our institutions is for the sake of the people we meet. No institution is more important than the people. By the way, that's the hallmark of Catholic teaching ethically. Nothing is more important than the dignity of a human being. So if we're talking about practicing peace, be it in how we configure a church, how we grocery shop, the sacredness of each other. Number 2, it is not our duty to finish the work, but neither are we at liberty to neglect it. Rabbi Tafan. See, I'm tempted, if I can't do everything, I do nothing. If I can't see the worthwhileness of it, why would I do it? I am part of a family of humankind involved in the work. I do my part. Number 3, from the Quran, chapter 49, verse 13. Oh, humanity, we, referring to God, made you races and tribes so that you may know one another. The Quran teaches that we are created differently, that we might meet each other in our differences and rejoice. The Quran further said that if God wanted to make you the same, God would have. Reflecting upon that, then, our differences, which can lead to disagreements, are also the differences that reveal the splendor of God. What if we looked at the diverse religions of the world as the religions of God, as the manifestations of grace? What if we looked at all of the ways human beings configure life and make sense of it as the pathways of the divine? Number 4, from the Gita of Hinduism. Recognize the one undivided spiritual essence of all living beings, though they may be divided into innumerable forms, is true knowledge. Not just simply human beings, but all beings, everything that exists. Or as the creed says in the church, things visible and invisible. I love that in the creed. When the creed said visible and invisible, I love the invisible. Ooh, what are all the invisible things? Gravity, radio waves, microwaves, the energy from the sun, the energy from the moon, the forces in the universe. See, that's when the church building points to and reminds us of the cathedral of the universe. Number 5 is one of my favorite statements that I was at a Shiite mosque in Pleasanton a couple of months ago for the break in the fast for Ramadan. And there was a poster on the wall, and I said, I just love that poster. And the people took it off the wall and gave it to me. Wow. It's not too many places I go to where I say I love something and they give it to me. And it's what the poster said. It's from Imam Ali. People are of 2 types. Either your brother or sister in faith or your equals in humanity. And this is not to put faith in opposition to the world, but rather that faith points to the world. Unless you belong to a philosophy where God didn't make the world. If you have a philosophy where the world is a mistake, but if you're in the philosophies where God is the creator in the sense of a mother of us all, then that has great implications. One day, I was talking to some middle-aged gentlemen who were talking about their mother. I said, you know, Tom, every day Mom used to remind us that we were brothers and sisters of one another. We would forget that. We each thought we were her children. And she kept reminding us of our relationship to one another. That's what great people do. Great people don't suck all the energy out of the room for the sake of themselves, but keep reminding us of our relationship one to another. At the very end of the paper I gave you, there's a friendship in the world that we really have to pay attention to in wake of the death of Desmond Tutu several months ago. The Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu were best friends. Here's two of their prayers. I thought it would be very appropriate to give that to you today in honor of this day. I'd like to conclude with a prayer from the Dalai Lama. May all beings everywhere plagued by suffering of body and mind obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by the virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by oppression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing and the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth. May the weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains, bountiful harvest. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound free. May the powerless find power. May people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Here's that beautiful sense of an alignment with what is, that comes from within. So blessed International Day of Peace to all of you. May every day be the International Day of Peace. Practice peace in all the affairs of your life, all the ordinary affairs of life, awake or asleep. with the prayer and the hope that if we can do this one day today, then maybe we can do this one day at a time for the rest of our lives. God bless. Love you.
We love you too. Thank you
Father.
so much for that. What a beautiful way to honor this day.
Mhm.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you, Father.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
We
Father.
look
Thank
forward
you.
to seeing you and the rest of everyone else next week, same time.
As I'm walking in the streets of Brentwood, I'll carry you in my heart.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that sounds wonderful. Enjoy that. All righty. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you, Father.
Take care.